You're right, the men were sandwiched between the two women. And I thank Family of the Heart for letting me come here and exercise my freedom of speech. I write a weekly column for the Toronto Sun, and I write about sensitive issues all the time, so I'm acutely aware of them. Oops. You don't want me to speak.
We want to hear you. We want to hear you.
Can you? Good now? So anyway, I would like to discuss the sort of the rationale or the philosophical underpinnings of the notion of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is something free societies hold dear. And let's look at why this is. And let's look at why freedom of speech is something we better not tamper with, unless we have a damned good reason for it. From where I stand, it is crucial to allow freedom of the press. This freedom must be extended to social media, like Twitter and Facebook. Freedom of conscience in both public and private gatherings, as well as academic research. The most important question to ask in this debate is, who in a free society is entitled to free expression? For example, if you are a Shia Muslim living in a predominantly Sunni country, do you have the right to challenge traditional Sunni interpretations of Islam?
No.
You don't theoretically, but you should. If you are a liberal Democrat living in a communist republic like China, can you protest freely against autocratic rule? Or must you be subjected to the kind of treatment the students at Tiananmen Square endured some 20 years ago? If you are a Sufi Muslim living in Saudi Arabia, are you allowed to preach Sufism? Now, what if the tables are turned? If you are now a Sunni living in a Shia majority country, should you be allowed to practice and preach your faith freely, which would inevitably involve challenging the majority view? If you are a Muslim living in a country that prohibits religion, as happened in the former Soviet republics, should you be allowed to protest such restrictions? If you are a practicing Muslim living in Kemal Atatürk's Turkey, should you be allowed to wear the hijab in public? So just who is entitled to freedoms is absolutely crucial to this debate. Unfortunately, we have seen many assaults on freedom of speech in recent years. Not everyone agrees with state religions or the political views of the establishment. Each individual is unique and a product of his or her experiences in life, his or her inherent capabilities, temperament, and talents. Some of these are personality traits that are shaped by the individual. Some of these the individual inherits and has no control over. How stifling it would be for a Sunni to not be able to practice his or her faith in a Shia country. I'm not promoting Muslim causes here, I'm just trying to bring home a point, and I'm trying to put Muslims into the shoes of other people. The whole idea of freedom of speech revolves around protecting dissident minorities from the tyranny of the majority, whoever that minority or majority might be, regardless of their unique stance or perspective on life, governance, politics. They may challenge our sincerely held beliefs. We may cherish these beliefs because we have been brought up to believe in their absolute truth and moral superiority. But individuals who challenge them also have the right to not only hold such opinions, but also to express them freely through discourse or artistic expression, because they too have been brought up to believe in the moral superiority and validity of their beliefs. I think most people agree that some freedom of speech is acceptable. But what about religion? And here I would like to counter some of our friend Asma Barsi's statements. And the internet has recently been flooded with all sorts of debates about the limits of free speech. Even many liberal Democrats stress that religion, at the very least, is sacrosanct and must be spared even the minutest criticism. Regrettably, and I say regrettably in my view, even people who espouse secularism have been advocating the view that people must still tiptoe around religion, especially Islam. They explain that disrespect prompts violence, and it is obviously more crucial to preserve lives than to be free to ridicule. They imply blame to the victims who have died as a result of Muslim anger. They in part blame the victim. But in my humble view, it is Muslim sensibilities on these issues that must change, not the Western tradition of free thought and satire. Satire, ladies and gentlemen, is not the culprit here, but rather the violent overreaction to perceived insults. People do not deserve to die, or tortured, or beaten for their sincerely held beliefs. One can think of many recent examples of individuals being targeted for what they believe, even for who they are. Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia was being administered 50 lashes a week for speaking his mind. Other individuals have been harassed, beaten, beheaded, burned, killed, or assassinated for even defending dissident minorities. Salman Taseer, governor of the Punjab province in Pakistan, was shot dead for simply defending Asiya Bibi, a Christian woman accused of blasphemy. The blasphemy law, especially in a country like Pakistan, has been greatly abused. People have used the law to score personal vendettas. All one needs is to accuse the opponent of blasphemy. The case of Asiya Bibi is well known. And the worst part about blasphemy laws is that the prosecution need not prove an intent or what is known in law as mens rea to establish guilt. Unintentional, overt acts of perceived blasphemy can be enough grounds for conviction under Pakistan's draconian laws. The case of the doctor who accidentally threw a piece of paper with the name of the Prophet Muhammad inscribed on it was apprehended for blasphemy, even though his act was unintentional. With the laws as draconian as these, there is absolutely no way that freedom of conscience or opinion can be exercised, let alone freedom of speech. Blasphemy laws have to go. Therefore, where free speech is not permitted, there is an emphasis on uniformity of opinion, at least in the public domain, when such a uniformity is neither realistic nor desirable. What would happen if no one was ever able to challenge some of the most horrendous human rights abuses that we have seen in the course of human history? Look at what happened in the American South for centuries. Slavery in the American South was the most brutal and barbaric institution. It remained unchallenged for centuries. It was even justified on religious grounds that the black Africans were in fact the progeny of the biblical prophet Noah, Noah's outcast son. Till such time there was uniformity of opinion, the black captives from Africa were condemned to a life of slavery, along with their offspring, and suffered the most heinous human rights abuses. Were it not for the abolitionists, who challenged many of the philosophical and religious justifications for slavery, that the institution finally came to an end with the Emancipation Declaration in 1865. There are many religious and cultural practices even today that continue to brutalize individuals. The worst part is that there is resistance even today to entertaining criticism of such practices because they are considered sacrosanct. Take the case of female genital mutilation in parts of Islamic North Africa. The practice is merely an interpretation of Islam, but for those who actually practice it, it is considered an important tenet that must never be challenged. It is a dreadful abuse of the human rights of female children who are not in a position to refuse the procedure. Now, if I am a non-Shafi'i person living in Shafi'i Egypt, do I have the right to question the practice? The rest of the Muslims who don't agree with the practice know that it is not required by Islam, but if they were living in Egypt as a minority, would they be able to challenge this practice? So the question again is, whose practices can be challenged? Who can challenge it? And how does one solve the problem of giving every human being the right to think freely and speak their mind freely? In Canada, freedom of speech is safeguarded in Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is rightly characterized as a fundamental freedom. Every democratic society guarantees such a right. And every democratic society also places reasonable limits on it. But the main philosophy behind freedom of speech, in my view, is to ensure equality to individuals. Therefore, we must assess equality in the context of who and what. In other words, whose ideology, religion, or political philosophy is immune from attacks? Is it the establishment's? Should only state religions be protected? And we have all seen that even among followers of some religions, there can be several outlooks and several legitimate bases for disagreement. Freedom of speech should in fact encompass even invalid bases for disagreement. So how can ordinary citizens be protected? Recently, Sabeen Mahmood, a 40-year-old Pakistani activist, was shot dead for organizing a lecture series on Balochistan. She offended many people by adopting a stance which exposed the suffering of the Balochi people. The question is, do people have the right to hold such an opinion and to express it in public? Are the Balochi people really suffering, and do some individuals have the right to draw the public's attention to it? And even if they're not suffering, does Sabeen Mahmood have still the right to hold that opinion? Most of all, should Mahmood have died for her beliefs? The whole idea of guaranteeing freedom of expression is to ensure democratic equality to all citizens, regardless of their beliefs, religious, cultural, or political orientation. In a democratic society, people must have the right to hold any opinion, even if it offends certain individuals. The answer to any offenses caused by an individual's freedom of expression should never be violence, murder, harassment, or state-legislated punitive measures, as in the case of Asia Bibi and Raif Badawi. The answer to such quote-unquote offenses must only be in the form of discourse, better arguments, if possible, as intellectual challenges to such contentions. A healthy discussion on matters that concern all human beings is always in the interest of the public. It clarifies issues, it adds to the knowledge base of the human race, and eventually leads to societies that are based on humane principles of justice and equality. The world is a better place today, only because of people who dared to think differently and who were not afraid to speak their minds. Thank you.
I think I want to tell Rafiq Saab and Parvez Saab